Hello, my Titanic people! I really want to call you guys something, but I'm not really sure what. Like, for some reason I want to call you like my Titanic freaks or my Titanic files but that sounds bad. That sounds like inappropriate. So for now, I'm just going to say hello to you, person of Titanic interest. Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, my name is Genevieve, and every week, usually Monday, I put out a video about a real story from the Titanic. So every week, I give you the scoop on a real person or associated persons who traveled on the Titanic, and at the end of the video, I will tell you whether or not they lived or survived. I'll tell you about their experience, and if they happen to survive the Titanic tragedy, I will go on to tell you how they handled the rest of their lives living with the post-traumatic stress that everyone who was involved in that tragedy faced, and everyone dealt with it in like a little bit of a different way. So with that said, if you like the Titanic, if you are as mesmerized by the history and the stories of the Titanic as much as I am, then please subscribe to my channel and you will get awesome stories every week about the people of the Titanic. Also, if you genuinely enjoy this video, then please share it with someone else you know. Just send them a little text that's like, hey, this weird girl has some really interesting facts about the Titanic, and then they can watch it, and then you can talk about it, and then you can bond. Who knows? This could be a great way to even like pick up dates or something. So with all that fun stuff being said, let's just jump right into our family for this week, and that is the Collyer family. So the Collyer family was a young, very charming and popular British family of 3 people. Mom, dad, kid. 3 people. This is off to a great start. So the dad was Mr. Harvey Collyer, and he was born in Surrey, England on November 26, 1880. And he was one of 8 kids in a reasonably middle-class British family. His dad was a gardener and his mom was just a homemaker, and he seemed like, from all accounts that I've read, that he had a pretty average upbringing. Except for the fact that he suffered from epilepsy. And there's thoughts that maybe his epilepsy drove him to religion, to feel closer to God. So from a young age, he was very active in his local Christian church in Leatherhead, England. So involved, in fact, that by the age of 20, he was actually working for the church, and that is where he met his beautiful young wife, Charlotte. And Charlotte, the future Mrs. Collyer, also worked at the church in Leatherhead as a cook. So the 2 of them fell in love over their shared admiration of Jesus, I guess. And in 1905, when Harvey was about 25 and Charlotte was 24, the 2 were officially married. But scandal, even though they were officially married in 1905, it looks like from the dates, they had a child, their only child, out of wedlock, because their little sweet Marjorie Lottie Collyer, that is a mouthful, Marjorie Lottie Collyer. She was born in 1904. So who knows, maybe the dates are wrong, but I just think it's interesting that the Jesus-loving people, they had a kid, 1904, married 1905, I don't know. But needless to say, they had their beautiful little daughter, and they loved their minister at their church so much that they followed him to a new town and new community. So they moved to a place called Bishopstoke, Hampshire. Hampshire? Words are so hard, especially British words. Like, what am I saying? Bishopstoke. Anyway, in their new community, Harvey still worked for the church. He worked as a bell ringer, and then he was also a grocer. And this young family became very popular in their new community. They had a lot of friends, they had a lot of support, they were just really well loved and respected throughout the community. And it was while they were living in Bishopstoke that they got letters from some old family friends who had immigrated to, you guessed it, Fayetteville, Idaho. The glamorous Fayetteville, Idaho. And it actually seems like it had even been years that this family friend of theirs who had moved to Idaho had been writing them saying, oh my gosh, it's so great here. We have a fruit farm out in Iowa. The temperature is so great. The climate is so great out here in Idaho in America. you guys should really think about moving to Idaho. Your lives would be so much better, you know, the American dream and all that fun stuff. But the Collyer family didn't really take it that seriously. They kind of thought that was a pipe dream. They were relatively happy with their life in their community in England, and so they didn't do that. So they put that idea on the back burner. But suddenly, Mrs. Collyer got sick with tuberculosis. And keep in mind, these guys are still pretty young. Like, they were only like 30 years old, these two parents, back in this day. So Mrs. Collyer really wasn't that old when she got tuberculosis. And when that developed, suddenly it sounded like a really good idea to go somewhere that had a great temperate atmosphere, where the air was cleaner. So they decided to take a huge risk and leave their well-established community in England and immigrate all the way to Idaho in the United States. And they couldn't have picked a better time, because you know what? The Titanic was ready to sail. So the little family of three famously bought second-class tickets to ride the Titanic from Southampton, England to New York City in the United States. Before they left England, their friends and family threw them a huge party, and members of the church even had Mr. Harvey Collyer sit in front of the church, and they would all ring the bell for him. And Mrs. Collyer would later go on to say that the big fanfare around them leaving actually really haunted her after the Titanic disaster, because it felt too much like a final farewell. They were getting all this attention for leaving, and it's almost like Mrs. Collyer intuitively felt like they were really saying their final farewells. And finally, after all of the fanfare of saying goodbye and wishing them well to start this brand new glamorous life in the United States, on April 10th, 1912, the Collyer family boards the Titanic in Southampton. The family bought a second-class cabin for reportedly 26 pounds. Today, that'd be equivalent to about $3,500, so not super cheap, but what they got for their money was amazing to them. The next day, after leaving the Southampton port, Harvey Collyer sent a letter to his parents back home at the next port in Cobh, saying that the ship was like nothing he had ever seen. It was like the tables were so glittering and floating, and it was like they were on this floating town on the ocean that was just so amazing and spectacular. He also wrote that the ship was so smooth and the ride was so wonderful that you didn't even know you were on a ship. He said no one had seasickness, and they had just been having this wonderful time in their first 24 hours on the Titanic. But you and I both know that unfortunately that is not the full story of the Titanic. The ship was making great time cruising across the Atlantic. They were already over halfway there on April 14th, but early in the morning on April 15th, around 2:20 a.m., the huge ship hit a huge iceberg. And we all know what happens after that. But I want to tell you this story from the Collyers' perspective. According to accounts, the Collyers were so peacefully asleep in their room that they didn't even hear the bump or feel anything. It was Mr. Harvey Collyer that was awoken by just commotion of people in the hallways, and he went out to check on it. And then he came back to their second-class room and told his wife that apparently the ship had hit an iceberg. He also reassured his wife that it was nothing, they didn't seem that concerned, but there was just a lot of commotion up on the decks because people are confused and wanting to know what's going on. But at that moment, it seemed like, you know, it's gonna be fine. It's just an iceberg, but we're gonna keep going. When they got up to the deck of the Titanic, things were progressing pretty quickly though. You have to imagine that this ship hit the iceberg at 2:20 a.m. and it was already totally sunken by like 4:30 or 5 a.m. So in a very quick 2-hour period, this ginormous ship carrying over 3,000 individuals was already sunk. So chaos was ensuing quickly. Once the Collyer family was on deck and realized that they needed to evacuate on some of the life preserver boats, they were only boarding women and children. So Mom, Charlotte, and daughter Marjorie got into a boat. And it's at this point that I want to focus specifically on the daughter Marjorie. So remember, it's 1912 and little Marjorie, or as her parents called her, Madge, she was only 8 years old. But what's really special about her is even at her young age, she was incredibly perceptive, and she even submitted her account of what happened to a local newspaper. And her account of her experience on the Titanic is so fascinating that I would like to read a little bit of her direct account. So after she and her mother Charlotte were put in a boat and their dad was not in that boat, this is what she says. "My father raised me in his arms and kissed me, and then he kissed my mother. She followed me into the boat. The women in one of the other boats said they wanted somebody to row for them, and father got in that boat." Very fascinating. Let's keep reading. "There were so many in our boat that we had to sit up all the time. Nobody could lie down. My mother was so close to one of the sailors with the oars that sometimes the oar caught in her hair and took out big pieces of it. Ugh. There was one officer in our boat who had a pistol. Some men jumped into our boat on top of the women and crushed them, and the officer said if they didn't stop, he would shoot. Another man jumped and he shot him. My mother says I called out, 'Don't shoot,' but I don't remember it." Can you even imagine what that would feel like to be trying to row away from the Titanic and men are literally throwing themselves off of this giant ship, falling into your boat, like on top of you, and then there's sailors with guns just pulling out and shooting people? Again, the situation of the Titanic, it escalated from like 0 to 100 real quick. Within an hour, we're like, oh yeah, it's okay, it's just an iceberg, but we're cool. We went from that to, oh my God, I'm literally gonna fling myself off the ship into some boat on top of a lady because we're literally all dying. There's one other piece of Marjorie's account that I want to read to you because I think it's really fascinating and it's not one that I've ever heard before. She says, "The sailors had to row fast to get away from the ship. We could hear the band playing, but we didn't see the musicians. Only when we left, all the people on the decks were kneeling down, praying while the band played 'Near My God to Thee.' When the band finished, one of the musicians jumped into a boat with his instrument, and I guess he got away." Oh my God. Now that is something, it's like, can you even imagine that? This beautiful string quartet is very graciously playing music as the ship is sinking, trying to remind people it's okay, God's got us, we're gonna die, but you know, God's got us. And at the end of the song, one of the musicians is so like, F it, that he just takes his instrument and jumps into a boat. That is crazy. So here's the part of the story where I tell you if this family lived or died. And as you have probably suspected, that because Marjorie and her mother Charlotte got into that boat, they did survive. But unfortunately, even though Marjorie claims that she saw her dad get into another boat, that boat never arrived at the Carpathia, which saved the Titanic survivors. So for Harvey Collyer, one of three things might have happened. One, he never got on a boat and his daughter was just imagining a fantasy that she kind of wished. Two, he did get on a boat, but they perhaps rowed the wrong direction. They got lost at sea. Or three, he did get on the boat and that boat ended up being capsized. Because part of the reason the sailors in these little boats were trying to row so quickly away from the Titanic was because one, the Titanic as it sank was like creating a suction in the ocean that was pulling everything down. But then also there were all these people and things in the water and the people were clamoring, trying to get into boats, and that was capsizing the boats that were trying to get away. So we aren't really sure how exactly Harvey Collyer died. All we know is he was last seen on the deck of the Titanic kissing his wife and child goodbye, and then he was never seen again. He was only 32 years old when he died at the Titanic on April 15th, 1912. So what happened to Charlotte and Madge? I can't decide if I like calling her Marjorie or Madge. Both are kind of difficult for me to say, but they're both kind of cool names. So Marjorie and Madge obviously make it to New York on the Carpathia, and they are instantly over it. The trauma of going through that ordeal and losing her husband Harvey for Charlotte was too much, and she just didn't have the resiliency in her to follow through in starting a new life in the United States. All Charlotte Collyer wanted was just to be back in the familiar, back with her family and friends in England. She just did not want anything to do with the US anymore. which is understandable. It's already hard enough to try to start a brand new life in a totally different place. And then to try to start that after you go through this horrible tragedy and your husband dies, to me it makes total sense that all she wanted to do was just take her daughter back to England. So that's what they do. Within just a couple weeks of being in the United States, they get on another boat and they go back to England. In the years following the Titanic disaster, they were often approached to share their accounts and publish their stories about the Titanic. But other than just being a part of the general kind of obsession and fanfare that people had over wanting to know everything about the Titanic, the mother and daughter were really most interested in going back to living a very quiet, normal life the way that they had before this whole Titanic business even started. Charlotte Collyer was reported to not only be haunted by the big fanfare farewell that they got just for leaving, she was also really haunted and felt so guilty that it was somehow her fault that they even went on that journey, because it was because of her tuberculosis that they even considered leaving England. What happened to Charlotte is that eventually she did remarry another gentleman back in England, but she soon succumbed to a death due to complications with her tuberculosis. So what happened to her daughter, Marjorie Collyer? Well, when Madge was about 23, she married a local mechanic. And it was reported that they had one child together, but that child died in infancy and was never baptized, so therefore it was never reported. So it's kind of hearsay whether or not she actually did have a child. But other than that rumored infant loss, Marjorie never actually had her own kids. Not only that, but her mechanic husband died relatively young, I think when he was just 40, and Marjorie ended up living the rest of her life relatively quietly, just as a widow on her own. In the 1940s, she worked for a doctor's office as a receptionist, but other than that, she wanted to live a very quiet, honestly isolated life. That was just her way of dealing with the tragedy of losing her dad when she was just 8 years old in this horrible disaster, and then being left with this mom who just couldn't get over the guilt, and then who also died. Marjorie Collyer ended up living to be just 61 years old and eventually died of a stroke. So that Collyer family, or that little chapter of the Collyer family, kind of ended there. It kind of ended with the Titanic disaster, didn't have any more kids, and with Marjorie, the family kind of died out. Wow, what a happy story time. I'm just so fascinated by how that disaster really affected people moving forward. It's like, to me, I see the Titanic as like this pinnacle moment where all of these lives that are all over the world and all over the spectrum in terms of culture and wealth, all of these lives that had been seemingly so separate, all get sort of like tangled in together at one point that is the Titanic disaster. And afterwards, it's like, how do those people go on with their lives? It's a very fascinating look into tragedy and human nature. I hope you enjoyed this story of the Collyer family and their experience of being passengers on the RMS Titanic in 1912. If you enjoyed this video, as always, like it, like you like every YouTube video that you like. You give it a little thumbs uppy. And also subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss each new episode of different families or people we're gonna do in the future. And then share this, share it. Do you like that? Share the video. I don't know what kind of mood I'm in today, but anyway, I'll see you next week. Bye.